A month ago, the New York Times published a piece by Erica Good. Climate change denialists say polar bears are fine, scientists are pushing back. Turning the charismatic bears to their own uses, several denier blogs challenged evidence of the decline of polar bear population due to physical deterioration linked to the loss of Arctic sea ice. Nothing new. What spurred the Times article was a piece by 14 researchers attacking the disinformation campaign by attacking the credentials. The deniers, in turn, called the article a hit piece by climate bullies, smack talk, and then ramping up an act of academic rape. They demanded a retraction. They filed FOIA requests for 3 of the author's correspondents, and they suggested that one of them, Jeffrey Harvey, be reprimanded for conduct unworthy of serious scientists. Dr. Harvey explained that the article grew out of increasing frustration he and other scientists felt about the spread of false information, the disregard of established evidence, and the harassment of researchers. And Michael Oppenheimer was quoted in this column, he couldn't be here today, saying, "Some climate scientists basically have had enough of being punching bags." In defending their calculations of the status of Arctic ice and polar bear population, the scientists were making a larger point. That is, polar bears need sea ice. It's a question of habitat loss. As one put it, there's nothing more complicated than that. And they connected their research to the bigger picture of endangered habitats of virtually all life forms, including our own. So this modest case of witnessing is an example of the ethics of expertise. Men and women with specialized knowledge defend not only the integrity or validity of their research, but also its meaning and value. And the ethic of expertise requires meeting robotically repeated climate rejection with assertions of the authority of knowledge. And with this, professionals are drawn into political battle. For the delegitimation of experts and knowledge-producing institutions is wholesale today at the highest levels of government, and no attacks are more ferocious than on climate-related work and the regulatory law and policies that flow from it. And we see, I think, an escalation beyond fossil fuel industry disinformation and beyond the rejection of warnings by, say, commercial real estate developers, and even beyond the facile accusations of partisan bias. Today, they're beginning to take the bizarre form of conspiracist claims that ordinary professionals are part of a global cabal to weaken America or the West. As Melissa said, I'm co-chair with Bob Cohane of the Climate Change Working Group of the SSRC Anxieties of Democracy Project, and we're here to spur empirical research on the politics of climate change, and also to address moral questions raised by climate politics. And I think that this workshop on witnessing professionals takes up these questions from a sort of fresh angle, and the company here is an unusual mix. Our focus is the distinctive obligations that arise from our work and the actions that they impel. And everybody's been thanked so far except Melissa, so I want to add her. Well, in addition to the ethics of expertise enacted by scientists studying Arctic ice, there are broader norms of practice created and enforced by professional associations, what we could call professional ethics proper. The original learned professions, medicine, law, and divinity, evolved into self-governing associations. Today, states regulate and license them to some extent in accord with their public purposes, but these are powerful organizations that enjoy considerable autonomy and that want to preserve their autonomy to set formal qualifications and training and to discipline members. They dominate, police, and protect practice. And they also constrain what professionals can do with their specialized knowledge. Professional associations produce standards of practice for standard conditions, and professional schools teach professional morality, or what we call role morality, and they put it into the curriculum. And you know what these kinds of codes cover from your own associations. Responsibilities towards climates, or the terms of research on human subjects, or the requirements of data transparency. The American Bar Association Rule 3.7 is titled Lawyer as Witness, and that really got me interested until I realized that it referred to a rule prohibiting an advocate for participation in a trial where they're likely to be a witness. Because associations shape professional education and set the terms of advancement and publication and funding and governance and more, they can actively encourage climate work, as some do. Law schools, for example, create programs on environmental regulation and environmental crimes, including ecocide, and there are specialists who are uniquely situated to understand that climate change exhibits undemocratic wrath and their business is to define and document environmental injustice. Katrina, for example, didn't affect all New Orleans residents similarly, and social scientists who study this know who was evacuated, how it was evacuated, and who never returned to the Lower Ninth Ward. And professional peer-reviewed journals published this work. Also, professional associations can be collective advocates, right? The American Political Science Association, which is mine, is committed to public advocacy. They're out there lobbying and advocating on removing the citizenship question from the 2020 census, and even against gun carry on campus, something they never thought they'd have to do. But APSA has not taken a public position on climate or its own financial investments, although it could. So we also recognize, I think, the limitations of professional ethics, in part because the norms of practice really are designed, in part, to protect the association from political conflict and intervention. Take APSA again, I'm quoting here. As members of their community, professors have the rights and obligations of any citizens. Well, yes, but notice there's nothing about the special obligations that arise from expert knowledge. And when members do engage in civic activity, APSA warns, and I'm quoting, they must avoid creating the impression that they are speaking or acting for their university or department, or, and this is what the rule is about, the profession. In fact, professional norms can mandate silence. In relation to clients and proprietary information, for example, the norms of reticence can constrain experts whose recommendations have been rejected by policymakers and who then don't speak out about the dangers that come from failure to manage risk. And Scott Knowles' wonderful book, The Disaster Experts, talks about this. The Department of Defense, we know, researches climate change and its effects on military bases and supply chains, and what's now called the new face of homeland security and global insecurity and conflict inflamed by droughts and food scarcity. But the military now no longer publicly discusses its increasing strategic focus on climate-related disasters, and it's a mix of political pressure and self-censorship that inhibits, I think, this witnessing. So jaundiced critics have called professions conspiracies against the laity. I do like that line, but it's not so. That is, the professionals and professional associations serve important public purposes. But it is the case, I think, that we can question the adequacy of professional ethics designed for ordinary times, when what's required is what Elaine Scarry called thinking in an emergency. And so one of our questions is, do professions encourage or constrain witnessing? Why and where and how, and should they? And then there's political activism more broadly. Professionals move outside the company of colleagues and clients and enact a familiar repertoire in politics, and you know what that is. You publish and post in venues read by policymakers, you testify and you lobby before political officials, you sit on commissions, you talk to the press, you bring lawsuits and file amicus briefs, you create advocacy groups and transnational organizations, and very importantly, I think, and less often noticed, political coalitions. And professionals ferret out entrees for influence, often directed at changing public opinion. It seems, reading the latest Pew data, that public appreciation of the dangers of climate change has risen again after a period of decline. And there's widespread demand for action. Interestingly, the demand is for action more by corporations than by Congress. Still, public attitudes by themselves don't have any impact, and climate doesn't have political salience. That is, it doesn't determine participation or votes. Studies do suggest, one by two of my colleagues at Harvard, that the political salience of climate change arises when it's linked concretely to everyday life. For example, experiments that frame climate change in terms of public health risks caused by heat or pollution seem to increase its public salience. And so a second set of questions. How do you select these arenas? How do you assess institutional opportunities? How do you attempt to alter the normally very short time frames or time horizons of policymakers and the public? And then perhaps an unanswerable question, what counts as effectiveness? Right? Do we have any standards of the efficacy of witnessing? Communicating specialized knowledge to policymakers and the public in a way that can be absorbed and used is often described as translation. And at the same time, I think it has a real element of political ethics involved. Let me give you a short example. All kinds of work in climate science deal in uncertainty and risk. And we know that very often this is incomprehensible to people. And indeed, it seems to produce resistance to listening to the information. Just mentioning uncertainty about the course of Arctic ice seems to justify casting doubt on the demographic trends of polar bears. And yet we know quite a bit, and Elke, I don't know where Elke went.
Right
there you are. We know quite a bit about the cognitive mechanisms that obstruct thinking about the long term. We know about the emotional obstructions to leveraging even personal experience into action. A member of our climate group, Doug Mcadams from Stanford, studies communities that suffer the shock of severe weather events, and he finds that even for them, the awareness of climate change is ephemeral. In short, experience is not a dependable impetus to political action. So the question of political ethics: how do we use this emergent knowledge of psychology and communication in counseling and prescribing? We know that soft paternalism and nudging can shape how we present information to influence action. Where is it warranted and by whom? We talk all the time about interpretive framing that can alter our understanding. Are there constraints on how we frame our knowledge and prescriptions? In the context of nuclear weapons, Hans Morgenthau talked about salutary fear. Should this be exploited? Should we exploit it? We know that demonization can be a very effective mobilizer in arousing anger, especially at named targets. Is that the business of climate professionals? These are matters that can engage us in the conflict of different levels of ethics. There are also obviously elements in this hoary discussion about the relationship between democracy and expertise, which is always one of tension. Citizens who march in 350.org carrying pictures of polar bears speak the language of civic responsibility, or conscience, or theology, or green values, or just sanity. And for the most part, their actions require departure from the routines of everyday life, which makes it difficult to sustain, although some activists, of course, do. Witnessing professionals, in contrast, are multilingual, mixing the language of specialized knowledge with the imperatives that come from the ethics of expertise and of professional norms and of political morality. And you, I think, do own the issue. It's inseparable from what you or we do every day. Speaking of the nuclear threat, Jonathan Schell wrote in The Fate of the Earth, and I'm quoting here, "The act of thinking about it is always voluntary, and the choice of not thinking about it is always available." Well, not really, if this is what you do in your work and it's part of your professional identity. One last thought. The scientists who pushed back against the deniers of the decline of polar bears show that to be a witnessing professional, at least in the United States, doesn't require the moral courage of Camus' rebel, which is not to dismiss the cost to colleagues who suffer harassment or loss of reputation, who have trouble with funding, or who suffer the ill will of university administrators who are angered by a too insistent campaign for divestment. But above all, we shouldn't underestimate the emotional cost of seeing advice and warnings and work repeatedly repudiated. I'm thinking of the geologists. These are two things from the New York Times just last week. I'm thinking of the geologists whose report for the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission was rejected. And then in a further slap in the face, the state legislature passed a law barring these agencies from developing even planning documents anticipating sea level rise. Or climate change specialists who heard New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu declare last month at the celebration of the city's 300th anniversary, quote, "This land on the banks of the Mississippi River will remain solid ground under the footsteps of those who will follow us." So it's no wonder that sometimes the voice of those responsible for Gulf Coast adaptation, who understand that there are limits to resilience, can register despair. Climate professionals, including many of you, and the world we're trying to protect, face, I think, a malignant trio of political opposition, political paralysis, and now political demolition. And yet, this workshop was spurred by Robert Lipton's account of being a witness to extreme events, more than one, and by his writing on witnessing professionals and climate change. He's given our subject its name, and he is really an unflagging voice for hope. So let's hear that now.